the most dangerous black stallion in Kentucky, had put 4 professional riders in the hospital, ended 2 trainers' careers, and hadn't let a single human hand touch him in 2 years. But on a cold October morning, in front of a Mafia boss and his armed men, that same furious animal walked forward on his own, lowered his massive black head, and pressed his nose into the open palm of a girl wearing a janitor's uniform, a girl still holding a mop in her other hand. And he stood there, still as a prayer, while she smiled a small, tired, beautiful smile, and stroked his black mane like she'd been doing it all her life. And the man standing behind them in the shadow of the barn door, the man in the $1,000 Italian shoes who 3 weeks earlier had laughed in this same girl's face, watched the whole thing happen and felt something crack open in his chest that no bullet had ever managed to reach. His name was Adriano Ferrante, 36 years old, third-generation boss of a Philadelphia family that never appeared in the newspapers because the newspapers had learned better, and to understand why that moment brought a man like him to his knees, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the morning it all started, the morning nobody noticed the cleaning girl by the east door. That morning, Adriano had flown in on a private jet with a check big enough to save a dying horse farm, and he'd watched the black stallion called Ombra rear, explode, and throw a professional handler into the dirt for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. And when the dust settled, Adriano didn't look at the horse. He looked at the row of farm workers standing along the wall in their faded, patched-up uniforms. And he laughed first, before any of his men dared to, and then his eyes found the young woman with the mop, and he said, loud enough for the whole barn to hear, "This place pays the people who shovel manure more than it pays for dignity. Probably because there's no dignity left here to shovel, isn't that right, sweetheart?" His men laughed with him then, that easy kind of laughter, the kind that costs the laughing man nothing and costs the one hearing it everything. And every worker along that wall looked down at their boots, every worker except her. Lena Hollis, 27 years old, wearing a gray uniform with someone else's name stitched on the pocket because a new name patch cost $12 she didn't have, didn't look down. She kept mopping, slow and steady, and inside her worn-out jacket sat a small leather satchel, cracked at the corners, smelling faintly of cedar oil, a satchel she'd carried for 9 years and never fully opened, because there was a photograph inside that she'd never once found the courage to turn face up. Nobody in that barn knew what she was carrying, but somebody knew something else, a 12-year-old girl named Quinn, the farm owner's granddaughter, standing quiet by the water barrel, watching the one thing the entire room had missed, the stallion's left ear, all morning, through every explosion of hooves, through every rich man that horse had thrown or chased or refused. That one black ear kept swiveling back again and again, patient as a compass needle toward the far corner of the barn, toward the soft scrape of a mop, toward the girl the Mafia boss had just laughed at. Because here's what powerful men never learn until it costs them everything. A horse doesn't see your shoes, your watch, or your bank account. A horse reads your hands, your breath, the quiet language of your body, and this unbuyable, unbreakable animal hadn't spent 2 years refusing people at all. He'd spent 2 years waiting for a cent he remembered, for the one person in the world who carried the same silent grief he did, and she'd been mopping floors 30 feet away from him, never letting herself look at him, because looking meant remembering, and remembering meant facing what really happened to her father 9 years ago. A buried story that would drag a janitor and a Mafia boss into the same fire. Within 30 days, the man who laughed at her would put everything he owned on the line for her. His empire, his family's darkest secret, and the first real feeling he'd allowed himself in 20 years. If you love stories where the people everyone laughs at end up being the ones everyone remembers, hit that like button. It truly helps us tell more stories like this one. Share this with someone who's ever been judged by their uniform instead of their heart, and subscribe with the bell on, because what this horse knows will stay with you long after the video ends. Now, let's go back to that cold October morning in Kentucky, back to the laughter, back to the girl who didn't look down, and back to the moment a Mafia boss began to learn what money can't buy. Laughter was still hanging in the stable air when Everett Calloway stepped forward, and he stepped forward with the gait of a 68-year-old man, trying to keep his back straight beneath a weight no one else could see. He had heard every word of that sentence. He had heard the laughter that followed it too. and he did what men who are about to lose everything are forced to learn how to do. He swallowed it down, all of it, without so much as a wince, because the check in that guest's vest pocket weighed more than his pride, at least for the next 30 days. Mr. Ferrante, he said, his voice steady and low, perhaps we should speak in the office. Adriano didn't answer at once. He looked down at the watch on his wrist, a small, slow gesture calculated to the second. The wordless language powerful men used to say that my time is worth more than your existence. 10 minutes, he said. I have a flight at noon. Everett nodded and held out his hand with the reflex of a lifetime spent in rural Kentucky, where every agreement began with a handshake. Adriano looked at that hand, at the calluses, at the swollen knuckles shaped by 30 years of reins and fences, then turned and walked toward the office without touching it, leaving the old man's hand suspended in the air like a question no one wanted to answer. Only one man in Ferrante's entourage saw the whole moment and didn't laugh. Aldo Greco, 58 years old, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, stood back with the eyes of a man who had witnessed too much to find anything funny anymore. He watched Everett's rejected hand lower. He watched the line of workers along the wall, their shoulders tightening in silence, and for one brief instant, his gaze came to rest in the far corner of the stable, where the sound of a mop still moved in its steady rhythm, no faster, no slower, as though that rhythm were the only thing in this barn that couldn't be bought or broken. Aldo said nothing, but some silences are merely empty, and some silences are remembering. Inside the office, the negotiation unfolded exactly the way a knife passes through meat. Adriano sat in the best chair without waiting to be invited, set one elbow on the desk, and began taking apart the horse's value in the voice of a man reading an autopsy report. 4 jockeys hospitalized, he said. 2 trainers quit the profession. 2 years without anyone laying a hand on it. What you're selling isn't a stallion, Mr. Calloway. What you're selling is a lawsuit waiting to happen, and I'm the only man in this state still interested enough to pay for your trouble. The number he gave afterward was so low that Everett needed a second to be certain he hadn't heard it wrong. His bloodline is worth 5 times that amount, he said. Bloodline, Adriano repeated, and in his mouth the word sounded like a joke. Bloodline doesn't pay bank debt, Mr. Calloway, and according to what my people found out, you have exactly 30 days before the First Bank of Lexington forecloses on this land down to the last blade of grass. The room went silent. Everett sat very still, and that stillness spoke louder than any denial could have, because the 30 days were accurate, cruelly accurate, and both men knew that from this moment on, the negotiation was no longer a negotiation. It was a surrender with terms. Adriano rose, buttoned his vest again, and walked toward the door with the stride of a man who had won before the cards were ever dealt. But in the stable corridor, between him and the October sunlight outside, stood an obstacle just under 5 feet tall, 2 braids, an old canvas jacket, and gray eyes staring straight up without blinking. Quinn Calloway had been waiting there for no one knew how long. I heard you're going to buy Ambra, the girl said. Adriano looked down at her with the faint amusement of an adult about to bestow 3 seconds of generosity. If your grandfather has any sense, then yes. The girl didn't step back. She tilted her head slowly, as though weighing whether the man before her deserved what she was about to say, and then she spoke in a voice so clear and bright that every worker along the row of stalls heard each word. You can buy him, but you can't buy what he knows. For one very brief moment, no one in the stable breathed. Adriano Ferrante, the man who made the hardest men in Philadelphia choose their words carefully before opening their mouths, stood there looking at a 12-year-old child, and for the first time all morning, he couldn't find an answer quickly enough. Then he stepped around the girl, went out to his car, and the black convoy rolled away from Calloway Ridge in the thin dust of the gravel road. But Aldo Greco, seated in the passenger seat of the last car, looked back through the rearview mirror exactly once, toward the stable, where the girl still stood in the corridor, and farther beyond her, where the young woman with the mop had stopped moving and was watching the convoy leave with the eyes of someone who knew more than all she allowed herself to say. That night, the city of Lexington split into 2 worlds, and the border between them didn't lie on any map. In the first world, inside a 4-story office building on Vine Street, Lena Hollis pushed her cleaning cart through empty corridors beneath cold white fluorescent lights, her second shift of the day, beginning at 7 o'clock in the evening and ending only when the last trash cans had been emptied. She moved with an unhurried, mechanical precision, navigating the silent building with a focus born of sheer survival, knowing that maintaining her composure was the only way to keep a body stretched across 16 hours of labor each day from breaking. On the third floor, she stopped before the glass door of a law office, where leather chairs and gold-framed diplomas glowed in the darkness, and she looked at them for exactly 2 seconds, without longing, without bitterness, only taking note, the way a person takes note of the weather in a country she will never set foot in. Well past midnight, she reached the trailer at the southern edge of town, where the October cold had slipped through the tape-sealed window cracks and was already lying inside the blankets, waiting for her. She hung her yellow rubber gloves on the clothesline stretched across the sink, beside another pair, with a hole in the index finger that still hadn't been allowed to retire. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and opened the stack of mail she had avoided opening for 3 days. The bill from Meadowbrook Nursing Home, the first payment overdue, the second payment overdue, and a third letter with a red stamp that she read more slowly than the other 2. Line by line, a letter informing her that if payment was not completed before the 15th of next month, Ruth Hollis would be moved from the memory care wing down to the public nursing ward, where one nurse watched over 30 beds, and the walls had no pictures. Lena set the letter on her knees. She didn't cry, didn't crumple the paper, didn't do anything a person would do if she still had energy left for emotion. She only sat there in the cold trailer, beneath the single desk lamp, and looked at the small leather pouch on top of the nightstand, the pouch with worn corners and the faint scent of cedar oil, the one she didn't reach for, not tonight, perhaps not ever. Then she turned off the light and lay listening to the wind scrape along the trailer walls until dawn was nearly there, and sleep still stood outside the door. At the same time, 9 miles to the north, in the second world, Adriano Ferrante stood by the penthouse window of Lexington's most luxurious hotel, with a glass of whiskey he hadn't yet touched to his lips. He had removed his platinum cufflinks and placed them in the leather tray on the table, 2 small points of light worth 6 months of wages for anyone, in the line of workers that morning, and he stood there barefoot on the thick carpet, looking down at the lights of horse country, spread beneath him like a chessboard, waiting for the next move. The phone on the table vibrated exactly on time, as it did every night. The voice from Philadelphia belonged to an older man on the family council, dry and direct. The Kentucky channel, the voice asked, "Is everything on schedule?" "On schedule," Adriano answered. "The horse is only the front," the voice reminded him. "Don't let it eat up more time. Buy fast, transfer fast. The elders at home don't like anything left hanging." "I know what the elders like," Adriano said, and there was a new coldness in that sentence that made the other end go quiet for 1 beat before the call ended. He set the phone down, took his first sip of whiskey, and found it flat. Then, because the room was too silent and the night too long, he did the thing he only did when no one on earth could see him. He unlocked the black leather briefcase, lifted the false lining at the bottom, and took out a sheet of paper that had been folded into quarters, so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. A colored pencil drawing, clumsy and solemn in the way only children's drawings can be, showing a farm with a white fence, a red-roofed stable, horses with 4 straight stick legs standing beneath a sun much too large, and in the lower corner, in the careful handwriting of a child trying hard to make it beautiful, a signature, Emilio, 9 years old. Adriano sat down on the edge of the bed with the paper resting across both hands, carefully as though it were made of ash, and looked at it for a very long time without reading it, because he had known every pencil stroke by heart for years. Outside, the city clock struck 3 o'clock in the morning. In the trailer on the southern edge of Lexington, a young woman lay awake with a debt that bore the name of a mother. In the luxury room to the north, a wealthy man lay awake with a debt that bore the name of a 9-year-old child. The 2 debts did not know each other, not yet, but they were beating in the same rhythm in the darkness of the same city, and only one black horse stood between them. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Callaway Ridge was still sunk in the blue-gray darkness of the hour before dawn, and Lena Hollis was the first person to push open the stable's side door, as she did every day, because the early shift was the one nobody fought for, and being alone was the only luxury she could still afford. She switched on the row of low lights, hung her coat on the iron hook, and began the work in a sequence that had become part of her bones, sweeping the center aisle, filling water, pouring feed, but something was different this morning. Because her feet slowed when she passed the last stall in the row, the stall she had taught herself for so many mornings to walk past without looking, and this time she stopped completely. Perhaps it was because the red stamped letter was still lying in her pocket like a cold coal. Perhaps it was because the sleepless night had worn away the last layer of her defenses. Or perhaps, simply, because the horse was already standing there, close to the bars, silent in the darkness as though he had been waiting for her since before she knew she was coming. Lena stood 3 steps from the iron bars. The black horse's breath stretched into the cold air in thin columns of smoke, slow and even, not the breathing of an animal that had thrown 4 men into the hospital, but the breathing of a very old kind of waiting. She took the first step. He didn't move back. She took the second step, and the great black muzzle tipped downward, nostrils widening, drawing in the air between them in one long, searching breath. And Lena knew what he was smelling, the scent of cedar oil that had soaked into the fabric of her coat for 9 years. From the leather pouch she carried with her, the way people carry a wound, her own breath caught somewhere beneath her breastbone. The third step. Now only the iron bars stood between her and that midnight black head, and the horse pressed close to them, pressing one side of his face against the cold metal in a way no untamable horse on earth ever would, and stood still. Lena's right hand left her side, so slowly it barely seemed to move, slipped through the space between 2 bars, and her fingers, cracked from cleaning chemicals, touched his mane, only touched it, only rested there, not stroking, and the whole half-ton mass of muscle trembled once, very faintly, then released a long breath that seemed to come from the very bottom of him. And Lena Hollis stood there in the stable at 5 o'clock in the morning, with her fingers buried in the mane of a black horse, her eyes burning because of something she hadn't yet allowed herself to name. Footsteps sounded from the head of the corridor. Not hurried, not heavy, the sound of leather heels on concrete. And Lena pulled her hand back as fast as if she had touched fire, while the horse jerked his head away from the bars, both ears snapping back, his dark body retreating into the shadowed stall with a stomp that shook the ground. Adriano Ferrante stepped out of the hallway's darkness, in a black overcoat with the collar raised. 2 hours early for the meeting meant to squeeze the last terms out of Everett, and from the look on his face, Lena understood he had been standing there long enough. He stopped 5 steps from her, looking her over from head to toe, the gray uniform, the worn boots, the name tag that wasn't hers, then looked toward the stall where the horse was snorting in the dark corner, and something moved behind his eyes, not emotion, but numbers rearranging themselves. 2 years, he said, his voice cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of warmth. 2 years, and no one has been able to get within 10 feet of that animal. I've read the files, watched the footage, paid 3 of the best behavior specialists on the East Coast to tell me this horse is ruined. He tilted his head by the slightest degree. And yet he just pressed his face against the bars because of you. Lena didn't answer. She bent to lift the feed bucket as though this conversation did not exist, and that very calmness sharpened his voice by another notch. $5,000, he said. Cash, no paperwork, no one has to know. From now until the transfer day, you soften that animal enough for my people to load him onto the trailer without another hospital record. For someone mopping floors on 2 shifts a day, I believe $5,000 is a number that speaks. Lena straightened. She looked at him for the first time, directly, without flinching, her eyes shadowed from a sleepless night but steady as bedrock, and when she spoke, the sentence was so brief it was over before he could prepare himself. He isn't a safe to be cracked open. She lifted the feed bucket to her hip and walked past him, close enough that the hem of his overcoat stirred, and the sound of her boots faded toward the far end of the stable, steady, not a single step quicker than the last. Adriano Ferrante stood alone in the half-lit corridor, among the smell of straw and horses, with the $5,000 he had just had refused still untouched in his coat pocket, a feeling so unfamiliar that it took him several seconds to recognize it, and its name was rejection. He took out his phone, dialed a number, and when Aldo picked up on the other end, his order was only 4 words, clean as a knife cut. Look into her. Aldo Greco needed less than a day. He returned to Adriano's hotel room at dusk with a thin folder and the face of a man who had just finished reading a sad story, then set the papers on the table and spoke in the low, even voice of 40 years in the business. Lena Marie Hollis, 27 years old, born in Woodford County, Kentucky. Works 2 jobs, mornings at the horse farm, evenings cleaning offices on Vine Street. Lives alone in a rented trailer on the south edge of the city. No criminal record, no credit card debt, not even a parking ticket. Her mother is Ruth Hollis, 63 years old, dementia, currently at Meadowbrook, 2 payments overdue. Aldo paused for one beat, long enough for Adriano to lift his eyes from the folder, then he let the rest fall. And her father was Wade Hollis. The name dropped into the room and lay there. Adriano frowned, searched his memory, and found it in the place where people keep news that has nothing to do with them. An old scandal from the sports pages, 9 years ago. The most famous horse trainer in the Bluegrass region, caught with a positive doping result in his own stable, permanently stripped of his license by the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission. His farm foreclosed, and dead of a heart attack 6 months later. He remembered the name the way a man remembers the headline of an article he skimmed in an airport waiting room, nothing more, with nothing in it that belonged to him. Wade Hollis's daughter is mopping stable floors, Adriano said, almost to himself. And in his voice, there was only the professional curiosity of a man who had just found the missing variable in an equation. It isn't magic at all. The horse didn't gentle for some random cleaning woman. It gentled for a hand taught by the best man in this state. He tapped one finger on the folder twice, slowly, and the calculating machine behind his eyes shifted toward a new move. But 9 miles away, in the small office at Callaway Ridge, that name did not lie still so easily. Everett Callaway heard the news from Quinn's own mouth, the girl telling it as though she were telling some strange little story. That Mr. Ferrante's people had been asking the workers about Miss Lena today. About her father, too, Grandpa, that old horse trainer Hollis from years ago. And Everett had gone motionless in the middle of his granddaughter's sentence, like a man who had just heard footsteps on the lid of a grave. That evening, for the first time in many years, he locked the office door from the inside. He took from the lowest drawer a bottle of bourbon still 2/3 full, and a yellowed paper envelope, and he sat for a long time beneath the desk lamp, drinking in small swallows he could not taste, before his shaking hand drew from the envelope a photograph clipped from an old newspaper. A picture of a hearing room 9 years earlier. Rows of wooden benches, men in suits, Wade Hollis sitting at the table on the left with the straight-backed posture of an innocent man. And in the witness row behind him, a face Everett Callaway knew better than any face in the world, because it was his own face, 9 years younger, looking down at his hands. He turned the photograph face down on the desk. Outside the window, the stable light still burned in yellow squares against the darkness, and Everett sat there with the bottle, not knowing what shape his fear had, only knowing that it had slept for 9 years, and someone had just knocked on the door. The next morning, Adriano Ferrante's new offer was placed on Everett's desk, in the voice of a man who was not used to being refused twice. "I'll pay the full price you're asking, not 1 cent less, on one condition. The cleaning girl, Hollis, will be the horse's private handler for the 30-day transfer period, every day, until he walks onto my trailer willingly. I'll pay her salary, 10 times what she's making now." Everett relayed the offer at noon, in the stable corridor, with eyes that avoided looking directly at Lena longer than necessary, and Lena listened to it all without interrupting, both hands still inside her work gloves. She didn't think about the man with the Italian shoes, or his voice as flat as steel. She thought about the red-stamped letter in the drawer of her trailer, about the public nursing ward where one nurse watched over 30 beds, and the walls had no pictures, about her mother's hand still holding a pencil every afternoon, and her calculation was finished before Everett stopped speaking, a calculation that had no room for pride, because pride didn't pay nursing home bills. "All right," she said. Then she looked straight at Everett and added one more sentence in a voice so calm it was harder than any vow. "But tell him this for me. I work for the horse, not for him." She turned toward the far end of the stable, where the great black shadow stood waiting behind the bars, with both ears pricked forward. And Everett Callaway watched her go, the young woman carrying the surname he had tried for 9 years to forget, now destined to pass his office door every day. And suddenly he understood that there are debts that don't collect with red-stamped letters. They collect by coming back, patient and quiet, wearing the face of the dead. The first of the 30 days began with a chair. Adriano's men brought it and placed it at the head of the training ring, a director-style folding leather chair, and he sat down in it at 8 o'clock in the morning, with black coffee, in a porcelain cup brought from the hotel, supervising his investment the way a man supervises a construction site. Lena did not look toward that chair even once. She worked with Ambra inside the round pen in the way her father's father had passed down, in a way none of the guards standing outside the fence could understand, which meant she almost did nothing at all, standing at the center of the ring with both shoulders relaxed, walking in a few slow circles, stepping back when the horse tightened and standing still when he softened, a wordless conversation that lasted for hours, and from the outside looked like a waste of time paid at 10 times the usual wage. By the third day, Ambra followed her around the pen without a lead rope. By the fourth day, he allowed her to lay the first saddle pad across his back in 2 years, and the whole farm held its breath waiting for the explosion. But the explosion did not come. It came only that afternoon, when a young bodyguard whose name no one bothered to remember decided the horse had become tame and stepped over the fence to take a close photograph. And in less than 2 seconds, half a ton of dark black muscle whipped around with both ears pinned flat to his skull, throwing a backward kick into the air exactly a handbreadth from the man's chest like a calculated warning, sending him sprawling into a mud puddle to the dry laughter of his own teammates. He was still a bomb, only now the bomb had chosen who held the pin. Adriano watched all of it from his chair, day after day, and his silence kept growing shorter until it turned into words. "You make me curious," he said on the 5th day, when Lena passed by to fetch water for the horse. "I've put a price on everything in my life, land, people, loyalty, silence too, and I always find the number. But what you do in that ring, I haven't found a number for it yet." Lena filled the bucket with water, in no hurry. "You put a price on everything," she said, not as a question. "Because everything has a price," he answered, with the voice of a man stating a law of physics. She lifted the bucket, walked past him, and let her answer fall over her shoulder the way a person drops a coin into a well. "No, everything has an owner, there's a difference." He could not answer her, for the second time in his life, since meeting the girl Quinn in the corridor, and he sat back down in his director's chair with his coffee gone cold, watching the woman in the gray uniform walk away, feeling as if one corner of his law of physics had just been chipped. Meanwhile, Quinn Calloway had appointed herself an apprentice without asking anyone's permission. The girl appeared at the fence of the round pen every afternoon after school with a notebook, asking questions so precise that Lena had to turn and look at her. "Why did you step back right when he tilted his head? Why do you never look straight into his eyes for more than 3 seconds?" And Lena answered every question with the seriousness one reserves for a colleague, because she recognized in this 12-year-old girl the thing her father had once said could not be taught, the eye that sees the animal instead of seeing itself inside the animal. On Sunday afternoon, her only day off that week, Lena took 2 buses to Meadowbrook with a bunch of wild daisies picked from the roadside and the first overdue nursing home payment covered by her advance wages. Ruth sat by the west-facing window in her familiar armchair, her silver hair neatly brushed by someone, and when Lena sat down beside her, she turned with the polite smile she gave to strangers. "The nurse is so kind today," she said. "She even brought me flowers." Lena placed the wild daisies in the plastic cup on the sill, both hands steady, her voice unchanged. "Yes, Mom, they're the last flowers of the season," and she sat there for 2 hours being the kind nurse, listening to her mother talk about a husband who had gone to deliver a horse and would be home soon, cutting an apple into small pieces, and swallowing down for the 1,000th time the truth that the woman she loved most in the world was sitting 2 handspans away from her and also an ocean away. Before leaving, as she always did, she opened her mother's drawing pad to look through it. The nurses said Ruth drew every afternoon, as regularly as taking medicine, and the pad grew thicker week by week, horses in pencil, standing, grazing, turning their heads back. Lena turned the pages one by one, and on the 10th page her fingers stopped because she recognized something she had never noticed, or had never dared to notice. Every horse in that drawing pad had been colored black, fully black, carefully black, and on the forehead of each one, without a single exception, her mother had drawn the same small detail again and again in swirling strokes, a star-shaped hair whorl set directly between the eyes. Lena sat very still. Outside the west-facing window, the afternoon sun slanted across the drawing pad, and Ruth looked at her daughter with gentle, unfamiliar eyes and asked, "What's wrong, nurse? Your face has gone so white." "It's nothing, ma'am," Lena said, and closed the drawing pad with both hands suddenly ice cold, because she had just remembered that on Ambra's forehead, directly between his eyes, there was a star-shaped hair whorl she had touched every morning all week, and her mother had never seen that horse in her life. On the 8th night of the 30 days, a storm rolled down from the Appalachian Mountains into the Bluegrass Valley, with only 2 hours of warning from the weather report. The rain came at 9 o'clock in the evening, not as rain but as walls of water slashing sideways against the stable roof, and by 9:20, a broken tree limb had crashed into the power line on the north side of the farm, throwing all of Callaway Ridge into a thick, clotted darkness amid thunder that kept exploding like naval guns. Lena was still at the farm. She had stayed late to watch Ambra's slightly swollen left ankle, and Adriano was still there too. His car had not made it out of the gate before the fallen tree blocked the only gravel road leading to the highway, so when darkness and thunder turned the stable row into a collective panic, 20 horses thrashing in 20 stalls, screaming, kicking the walls, their eyes rolling white in the flashes of lightning, there were only 2 people standing in that corridor, one in a janitor's uniform and one in a Milan-tailored suit. Lena had no time to consider Manor's storm lanterns. She shouted over the rain, "Metal cabinet at the end of the hall. Bring them all here," and then she ran toward the first stall, where a mare was trying to leap over the mesh door, and Adriano Ferrante, the man who for 20 years had only given orders and never taken them, stood frozen in a rare moment of sheer disbelief. But a sudden crack of thunder snapped him back, then obeyed. They worked in the darkness like 2 gears that had never known they fit together. She moved down the stable row with the same low, steady voice she used with Ambra, laying her hand on each neck soaked with frightened sweat, while he followed behind, lighting each storm lantern, pulling shut shutters being torn by the wind, hauling sandbags to brace the base of the big doors. And when the last storm lantern flickered as if it might die, because wind was pushing through a crack in the wall, and there was no dry rag within reach, he stripped the $1,000 vest from his body, rolled it up, and wedged it around the base of the lantern to shield the flame, without stopping for even half a beat to regret it. The yellow fire steadied again and shone over his hands, which by then were muddy up to the cuffs of his shirt. The first time in 20 years those hands had been marked by the mud of work, instead of the dirt of transactions. Well past midnight the horses settled. The storm lowered its voice into heavy rain, and the 2 exhausted people sat down on 2 hay bales facing each other at the end of the corridor, beside Ambra's stall, where the black horse was calm now, breathing evenly in the darkness with one ear still turned toward Lena like a compass needle seeking north. The storm lantern set between them cast light over 2 wet, mud-smeared faces, erasing for a few short hours the distance between a gray uniform and a white shirt, and in the silence where there was only rain and the breathing of horses, Adriano Ferrante suddenly spoke, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the small flame behind the lantern glass. "I used to know someone who would have liked tonight," he said. "It sounds absurd, who could like a night like this, but he would have. He would have said this is when horses need people most, and people need horses most too, they just don't know it." His voice changed when he said those words, younger, thinner, as though borrowed from someone else. "My younger brother," he went on, and the storm lantern flame leapt once in his eyes. He believed horses could heal people. Truly believed it, with his whole body, believed it in the kind of way my family thought was. He stopped. The sentence was cut off halfway, like a rein pulled tight without warning, and Lena saw it happen, saw the door that had just cracked open being forced shut by its own owner, with the full weight of a life trained never to open. He straightened his back, and when he spoke again, the flat steel voice had returned to its proper place. Old story. Lena did not ask. That was what made her who she was. She knew what a closed door looked like because she had one too, and people do not try keys in someone else's house when their own pockets are full of rusted ones. But in the moment when she leaned forward to turn up the fading lantern, and he bent down, at the same time with the same thought, their faces were suddenly closer than any rule allowed, close enough for her to see the dried mud along his jaw, and for him to see the dark circles beneath her eyes, and for 2.5 seconds as long as a season. Neither one of them moved, the small flame burning between their faces, the rain on the roof, the warmth of the horses breathing evenly in the dark. Then they both drew back at the same time, neither before the other, she turning away to adjust the lantern, he rising to brush straw from his trousers, and that moment was set down gently by both of them, not yet broken, not yet formed, like a card lying face down. Near dawn, the power crew arrived. The tree was dragged off the road, and Aldo Greco drove in to collect his boss, while the sky was still gray. He saw Adriano step out of the stable in a white shirt turned brown, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hair wet and clinging from the rain, the $1,000 vest slung over one shoulder and carrying the smell of lamp oil and wet straw, and behind him, at the end of the corridor, the cleaning girl was pouring morning feed for the black horse, as though it were an ordinary day. Aldo said nothing. He opened the car door as he always did. But as he circled around the front of the car toward the driver's seat, the 58-year-old man who had passed through every kind of darkness the Ferrante family possessed, allowed himself one thing he had not allowed in 3 years, a smile, small, hidden in the collar of his overcoat, the smile of a man who had just seen rain begin to fall on a field that had been burning for a long time. After the night of the storm, Lena reached the trailer close to 11 o'clock the next night, and on the doorstep, held down beneath a stone so it wouldn't blow away, there was a brown paper envelope with no sender's name on it. Inside were several photocopied pages from the horse registry at Callaway Ridge. Dry-typed columns about the origin of each horse, and one of those pages had been marked with a purple pencil, the same pencil she had seen tucked behind Quinn Calloway's ear all week. The girl said nothing, claimed nothing, simply laid the truth down on the doorstep the way someone leaves a gift that asks for no thanks. The marked page was about the black stallion, whose registered name was Ambra, 9 years old, brought to Callaway Ridge 2 years earlier, from a private owner in Ohio. Before that passed through a farm in Indiana. Before that a horse dealer in Fayette County. And the first line of that chain, the birth line, was printed in letters that could not be mistaken. Place of birth, Hollis Farm, Woodford County, Kentucky, first transfer method, seized property auction under court judgment 9 years ago. Lena stood in the middle of the trailer, with the page in her hand for a very long time, long enough for the desk lamp to grow warm, and then she did the thing she had been running from for 9 years. She reached up to the top of the nightstand, took down the leather pouch with the worn corners, and opened it all the way to the bottom. The scent of cedar oil rose and filled the small trailer, the scent her father had used all his life to clean saddle leather and bridle leather, the scent of misty mornings and hooves knocking softly over packed earth, and Lena took out each thing one by one, laying them on the blanket in careful rows, like someone taking inventory of an inheritance. The thick brown leather training journal, swollen with pages of notes written in Wade Hollis's firm, slanted handwriting, 1 page for each horse, 1 horse for each temperament, margin notes in pencil. This one is afraid of plastic. This one needs brushing on the left side first. Never rush this one. It isn't stubborn, it's just remembering. A bundle of letters tied with twine, envelopes addressed to the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission, to newspaper offices, to respected names in the horse world, all of them stamped, all of them unsent, appeals for justice written during the final 6 months of a man's life, by a man who knew no one still believed his signature. And at the very bottom, lying face down against the base of the pouch as it had lain for 9 years, was the photograph. Lena picked it up with both hands. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Outside, the wind left behind by the storm scraped along the trailer walls in long waves. She turned the photograph over. Her father stood in an autumn pasture, thinner than she remembered, smiling that squint-eyed smile whose shape she had forgotten, one hand resting on the neck of a black foal about 6 months old, all long legs and awkward bones, standing pressed close to him with the absolute trust of a living creature that had never yet been betrayed, and on the foal's forehead, directly between the eyes, clear enough that she didn't need to narrow her eyes to see it, was a star-shaped hair whorl. Lena's hands began to tremble. She turned the photograph over, and there, in that same firm, slanted handwriting, her father had written a dedication he had never lived long enough to give her, for Lena, when you're ready to train your own trust again. The date beneath the line was 1 week before the day 3 police cars turned onto the dirt road of Hollis Farm. Every loose piece of the past week collapsed into place all at once. The horses colored solid black in her mother's drawing pad with the star whorl between their eyes, drawn again and again every afternoon by a hand that had forgotten her daughter's face, but had not forgotten the last foal in her own stable. The way Ambra had pressed his cheek against the iron bars, the very first time Lena came near. The way that Black Ear had followed the sound of her mop all through that fateful morning, the scent of cedar oil soaked for 9 years into the fabric of her coat, and the photocopied page with the line that said place of birth, Hollis Farm. The most vicious horse in Kentucky was not vicious. He was Wade Hollis's final student, torn away from his teacher's hand in the middle of his first lesson in trust, sold at auction at 6 months old, along with fences and feed troughs like a piece of property, drifting through 4 owners in 7 years, and for 2 years at Callaway Ridge he had kicked away every hand that came near him, not because he was mad, but because none of those hands spoke the unfinished language he had been taught. Lena bent forward with the photograph pressed to her chest and cried. The first time in 9 years she had cried aloud, alone in the cold trailer among the keepsakes, spread across the blanket, crying for the father who had died with unsent letters, for the mother who kept drawing the same nameless horse, for the trusting foal in the photograph, who did not know that in 1 week his whole world would be seized, and for herself, the daughter who had abandoned the work of training because she could not bear to touch anything that smelled like her father. The next morning, she came to the farm earlier than usual, while the sky was still dark and not a single person was in sight. She walked straight to the last stall in the row, and the black horse was already standing there, close to the bars, as he was every morning, as though he had been waiting not 1 night, but 9 years. Lena pressed her forehead to his, directly over the star-shaped whirl, and spoke in the broken voice of someone who had just found something lost for far too long. "He taught you first," she whispered, "and only afterward did he have time to begin teaching me." The horse stood still, breathing long, warm breaths into the front of her coat, and at the far end of the corridor, the first light of the new day began to slip through the cracks of the eastern stable door. For 3 nights after that, Lena read her father's training journal from the first page to the last, a little each night, the way a person drinks medicine that heals and hurts at the same time. She read through every horse from the old Hollis farm, hearing her father's voice rise through the slanted handwriting, and on the 3rd night, when the pages of horse notes had ended, she turned to the final section of the journal. Pages where the handwriting suddenly changed, tighter, smaller, written in a different ink, as though they had been written in the late hours, and in an entirely different state of mind. There were no horse names here, only dates, times, and notes that made the trailer seem to grow colder by degrees the farther she read. Florida trip, March, double-decker trailer, front storage compartment sealed from the night before, 3 wooden crates marked equipment. I asked to open and inspect before loading the horses, refused, escort said orders from above. Louisiana trip, May, 2 crates, container numbers recorded here. A row of letters and numbers her father had copied carefully, as if copying evidence, sealed again, orders from above again. July trip, I stopped the truck halfway and demanded the compartment be opened. Driver called someone. 20 minutes later, another car arrived and pulled in close. I kept driving, came home and couldn't sleep. And then the last lines written close together, the letters leaning forward as if the writer were racing against something. I asked directly. The answer was don't ask. I said I would report it to the commission if the next trip had strange crates again. 3 days later, someone came to the farm, very polite. Southern voice, mentioned Lena's name, mentioned her school, only mentioned it, then smiled, then left. The next line held only 4 characters and a question mark, WP. Written large, darkened until it had bitten into the paper, circled twice. And the final line in the whole journal, dated 11 days before the positive doping sample appeared in the Hollis stables, was written in a hand that had grown calm again, strangely calm, like the hand of a man who had seen his opponent's next move. If anything happens to me, it didn't begin with a vial of medicine, it began with the wooden crates. Lena sat motionless for a long time. She did not cry this time. Tears had belonged to the night before, to the photograph in the black foal. But what was rising inside her chest tonight was something else, colder, heavier, with corners and edges. For 9 years, the whole state had believed Wade Hollis was a cheat. For 9 years, even she, on her weakest nights, had sometimes let that question crawl through her mind. What if? And the answer had been lying at the bottom of the leather pouch on top of her nightstand all those years. Inside pages she had been too afraid to open because she was too afraid to remember. Her father had not had anything to do with doping. Her father had been a horse hauler who had seen what he wasn't supposed to see, asked questions he wasn't supposed to ask, and been silenced in the only way that could make a horse trainer stay quiet forever, without a gun. They didn't kill him. They killed his signature. On Saturday morning, Lena took the journal into town. She chose the small copy shop on Main Street, the quiet self-service kind, and she stood beside the old copier for 20 minutes, copying each page of the final notes. 2 sets, one set she mailed to herself the way her father had once taught her, because a postmark was a timestamp no one could argue with, and one set she had sealed in thin plastic and hid beneath the lining in the bottom of her tool bucket at the farm. She did all of it alone, told no one, not Quinn, not Everett, and certainly not the man with the director's chair at the head of the training ring, because the final lesson in her father's journal had taught her that, in this part of the country, questions about wooden crates were answered with polite visits. She did not notice, and could not have noticed, that the nervous, low-wage clerk behind the counter had been watching her suspiciously, noting the old leather journal and the prominent names on the pages. The clerk, whose heavy gambling debts were quietly owned by one of Boyd Latham's local loan sharks, lost no time in slipping a phone out of his pocket the moment she walked out the door. 2 nights later, at 1 o'clock in the morning, in the small room above the tack storage at Callaway Ridge, Boyd Latham, the 45-year-old stable manager, 11 years on wages and 11 years in debts that would never be fully paid, sat on the edge of his bed with a prepaid phone pressed to his ear, the kind bought with cash at a gas station and thrown away after 3 calls. He spoke briefly, his voice low, his eyes never leaving the strip of light beneath the door. "The Hollis girl is digging up old business," he said. She copied a journal in town on Saturday, leather cover, old paper, all dates and serial numbers. Silence held for a long time on the other end of the line, the kind of silence with weight, and then a voice spoke, a man's southern voice, dripping with a calculated warmth, a low and syrupy drawl that could either praise a champion stallion or calmly dictate a death sentence, and that voice said only one sentence. "Tell me how much that girl resembles her father." He arrived on a beautiful Tuesday morning in a gleaming cream-colored vintage car that looked as though it had just rolled straight out of a 1960s catalog. And when he stepped out, all of Callaway Ridge seemed to have its light adjusted around him. The flawless ivory-tailored suit, the straw fedora held loosely in one hand, his silver hair neatly brushed back, and a broad southern smile spreading across his face before he even had time to offer the hand wearing a gold ring engraved with a family crest. "Whitfield Prescott." He introduced himself to Everett in a voice smooth, slow, rounded like aged bourbon poured over ice. "My friends all call me Whit, and I truly hope you will too, Mr. Callaway, because I've come here with the goodwill of a friend." In the bluegrass bloodstock world, the name Whitfield Prescott didn't need an introduction. 3 generations of bloodstock agents, an honorary member of every club with iron gates and 100-year-old oak trees. The man who had brokered the largest stallion deals on the East Coast for 3 decades, and Everett Callaway received him with the bewilderment of a small farm owner who suddenly found royalty standing on his doorstep. Prescott didn't circle the subject for more than 5 minutes. He represented a discreet investment fund, he said, people who truly loved horses but didn't care for the spotlight, and that fund had taken an interest in Mr. Callaway's black stallion. Then he named the figure. Everett had to set his coffee cup down to make sure his hand wouldn't tremble, because that figure was double, exactly double, the amount Adriano Ferrante had finalized after those merciless rounds of pressure and bargaining, and Prescott let the number fall lightly, the way a man drops a sugar cube into tea, accompanied by a smile. "Funds transferred within 72 hours. Sir, my fund isn't in the habit of waiting." The news traveled down to the stable before lunch, and Adriano Ferrante appeared on the porch of the farm office, while the cream-colored car was still parked in the yard. The 2 men came face to face on the gravel path, one in an ivory suit, one in a black overcoat, and the duel unfolded exactly as it does between 2 predators trained in different schools. Not a single roar, only courtesy sharpened into a knife. "Mr. Ferrante." "What a pleasure," Prescott said with a slight dip of his head. "I've followed your family's business for quite some time. A very long time, in fact. Philadelphia men have always done business so." He paused just long enough, decisively. Adriano looked at him with eyes that neither gave nor received. "And I only heard your name this morning," he said. Probably because I don't read the society pages much." Prescott laughed loudly, easily, full of warmth. "Oh, the society pages are dreadful, nothing but weddings and horses," he said, waving the fedora lightly. "But you know, men of my world live long because we remember everything. Old matters in Philadelphia, for instance. Back when your father was still in his day, the shipments, the prosperous seasons." And he said all of it in the harmless conversational tone of a man gossiping beside a fireplace. But for 1/10 of a second, only 1/10 of a second, his pale blue eyes held still on Adriano's face, like two pins pressed into a map. Then the smile spread again. "Well, I wouldn't dare keep you. Healthy competition is what made America, isn't it?" That afternoon, Prescott asked permission to see the horse, and the whole farm gathered along the stable corridor to witness it, Everett walking ahead, Prescott in the middle with his fedora in hand, and the moment he was still about 16 feet from the last stall, Ambra exploded. It wasn't the usual wariness he showed strangers, but a primitive eruption, the horse rearing inside the stall, striking both front hooves against the wooden wall in blows as heavy as sledgehammers, screaming in long bursts that tore through the air, eyes rolling white, foam spattering onto the iron bars, so violently that Everett had to spread both arms to stop everyone from coming closer, and Boyd Latham had to run over to pull the extra barrier into place. Prescott stepped back twice, one hand holding his hat, and gave a graceful, self-mocking laugh. "Well now, his reputation is well earned," he said. But no one in that corridor could explain why the horse that had softened all week under Lena's hand had suddenly turned into a storm. No one except those who had once heard a southern voice as smooth as velvet mention the name of a schoolgirl during a polite visit 9 years before. And there was no one like that in the corridor. Only the horse. The horse remembered. On his way back to the car, Prescott passed Lena, who was standing tucked near the tackroom door with her tool bucket in her hand. He didn't stop. He was far too courteous a man to stop before a cleaning woman, but his pale blue eyes slid over her the way they might slide over a fence, then caught on the old name tag, embroidered with someone else's name on the front of her uniform, and there those eyes paused for exactly 1 second. 1 second too long for any ordinary etiquette, 1 second belonging to a man who had read something that wasn't written on the cloth, before he put on his hat, nodded a farewell aimed at no one in particular, and the cream-colored car rolled soundlessly out through the farm gate. That evening, in the office, Everett sat between 2 sheets of paper bearing 2 numbers. On one side, a life raft for the whole farm, with a vague instinct behind it like the smell of smoke from far away. On the other half, the value along with the horse that was coming back to life day by day, under the hand of Wade Hollis's daughter, and he sat there for so long that Quinn, in her pajamas, came downstairs to look for him. The girl looked at the 2 sheets of paper, then at her grandfather, and asked in that clear voice that didn't know how to take the long way around, "Are you going to sell him to the man he fears, or to the man he chose?" Everett Calloway couldn't answer. Outside the window, the dark stable lay still beneath the stars, and in the last stall of the row, the black horse stood awake in the shadows, both ears still turned toward the gate where the cream-colored car had disappeared, as though he knew, with the kind of memory that didn't need language, that this wasn't over. That sentence would not leave Adriano's mind. Old matters in Philadelphia, back when your father was still in his day, the shipments, the prosperous seasons. A stranger did not say things like that for amusement. In Adriano's world, no one said anything for amusement. Every word was a chess piece pushed forward with purpose, and that man in the ivory suit had pushed his piece straight into the part of the board Adriano had believed he knew by heart. That night, he called Aldo up to his room and gave the order in 4 sentences. "Dig up the full file on Whitfield Prescott. Cross-check it against the family's old records from my father's time. Every transaction tied to Kentucky. And Aldo, don't use outsiders, do it yourself." Aldo Greco was gone for 3 days. He did not call, did not send a message, following the rule of matters that must leave no trace, and when he returned on the evening of the 3rd day, knocking on the hotel room door with his old leather briefcase in his hand, Adriano waited only to look at the face of the man who had served his family for 40 years, to know that whatever was inside the case weighed more than paper. Aldo sat down, poured himself a finger of whiskey without asking permission, something he had never done, drank it down, then opened the case. "The Kentucky Channel isn't new," he began, his voice low and even, like a man reading a prayer for the dead. "It's an old channel rebuilt. 20 years ago, Your father ran a route through the horse farms of the bluegrass region, goods moving inside interstate stallion transports. No customs officer stops a trailer carrying million-dollar horses just to search the tack compartment. And the local broker, the man who opened the gates to the prestigious farms, arranged the trips, bought the silence of the people who needed to stay silent. Aldo placed an old photograph on the table, showing two men shaking hands in front of a stable. One of them Renato Ferrante in the days when he still stood straight, the other 20 years younger than he had been on Tuesday. Though that southern smile could not be mistaken, was him, Whitfield Prescott. Adriano picked up the photograph, and Aldo went on, more slowly now, because the rest was the part he had spent a 3-hour night drive weighing whether to say at all. 9 years ago, a horse hauler started asking questions about the crates in a sealed compartment. He demanded they be opened. He threatened to report it to the commission. He became a name in the family's encrypted wires for 3 straight weeks, and that name, Aldo pulled out the final sheet, a yellowed copy of an internal telegram, with a rough approval scrawled in the corner in handwriting. Adriano recognized instantly, because it looked exactly like the signatures on his childhood birthday cards. That name was Wade Hollis. They discussed 3 options, Aldo said, and the one they chose was the cleanest. No blood, no body, no police. Prescott staged the positive test sample in the Hollis stable. A lab was bought, an inspector was bought, and the final approval signature for the whole operation belonged to your father. Aldo set the telegram down beside the photograph carefully, as though placing flowers on a grave, and spoke the final sentence in the voice of a man who had aged 10 years in 3 days. Your family didn't kill him with a bullet, Adriano. Your family killed him with disgrace. The room became so silent that the melting ice in the glass could be heard. Adriano sat motionless for a long time, both elbows on his knees, his hands clasped before his mouth, and the machine inside his head, the machine that had never stopped calculating, was calculating an equation in which every answer was loss. If he buried this file, burned it that very night in the hotel bathtub, no one on earth would know. The deal would go forward, the family's honor would remain intact, and the woman with the cracked hands would still look at him with the gaze from that rainy night beside the storm lantern, not trusting, not yet, but no longer hostile, a gaze he had begun to need in the way people need something they have not found the name for yet. But if he spoke, he would lose everything at once. He would lose her the instant she understood that she had brushed a horse's mane every morning under the supervision of the son of the man who destroyed her father's life. He would lose the deal, lose face before the council, and drag the Ferrante name into a matter the federal authorities only needed one loose thread to begin unraveling. He stood, walked to the window, then turned back, opened his own black leather briefcase, lifted the false lining, and took out the sheet of paper folded into quarters until it had gone soft as cloth. The drawing of the horse farm, the white fence, the red-roofed stable, the son much too large, Emilio, 9 years old. Emilio, the younger brother 7 years his junior, the only one in the family who had dared to say at the dinner table that he did not want his share of the family work, that he wanted to study horses, that he had already looked into it, that there were farms where horses helped heal soldiers who came back from war, children who could not speak, and that he wanted to build a farm like that. The whole table had laughed it off except one person. Adriano had not laughed. Adriano had told him, "Let me handle the dirty part, you just keep your hands clean." Then 3 years ago, on an April evening, the car that was supposed to take Adriano away from the restaurant had taken Emilio instead, because Adriano had stayed behind to sign one last agreement, and the men waiting on the corner had not waited to see the face inside. There was no blood in Adriano's memory. His memory was clean and cold as a morgue. There was only the sound of the telephone ringing at 10:40 that night, and the empty 11 seconds before the caller could make himself speak. "That bullet had my name on it." He'd said that sentence only once at the funeral to Aldo. It only read the wrong address, and Emilio. In the final weeks, during their biggest argument, and the last one they would ever have, had thrown a sentence in his brother's face, without knowing it would become his last word to him. "You're not cruel, Adriano. You've just never been allowed to try being decent." Adriano Ferrante stood in the middle of the luxury room, with the drawing from his dead brother in his left hand and the file on his dead father's crime lying on the table. The lights of Lexington burning gold beneath the window, and for the first time in his life, The man who had never hesitated did not know who he would be in the morning. He decided nothing that night. He only sat down on the edge of the bed, placed the drawing beside the file. 2 inheritances from 2 Ferrante men, one who had left him the chair, one who had left him the question, and he sat like that until the window turned gray. 2 days later, Adriano Ferrante did not shave, did not hold meetings, did not answer Philadelphia, and by the morning of the 3rd day, he called Everett Calloway only to say one sentence: "I need to borrow your office for an hour, and please tell Miss Hollis I want to meet. It has to do with her father, and she has every right to refuse." Lena did not refuse. She came late that morning, still in her gray uniform and boots dusted with sawdust from a shift left unfinished, standing in the office doorway with both hands at her sides, and saw the most powerful man she had ever met standing behind Everett's old wooden desk. No overcoat, no watch, only a wrinkled shirt and a file laid squarely on the tabletop, like a coffin made of paper. "Sit or stand, whichever you choose," he said. She stood. He nodded as though that was the answer he deserved, then spoke in a slow, even voice, rising nowhere, falling nowhere, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this opening line through 2 sleepless nights, and knew there was no version of it that would hurt less. "There is something about your father, and about mine. You will hate me after you hear it, and you have that right." Then he opened the file and placed the truth on the desk, piece by piece, the way someone lays stones for a grave. The photograph of 2 men shaking hands in front of a stable, my father, Renato Ferrante, and his broker in Kentucky, the man who sat drinking tea with Mr. Calloway on Tuesday. Pages from the family's old books, the shipping route from 20 years ago, contraband moved inside stallion transports, farm gates opened with money, and mouths closed with money, too. And the yellowed telegram, Wade Hollis's name inside it. 3 weeks of discussion, 3 options, and the option they chose: a positive test sample staged in the Hollis stable, a laboratory bought, an inspector bought, the approval signature in the corner of the page. "Your father didn't cheat," Adriano said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your father was the only decent man in this whole story. He saw what he wasn't supposed to see. He meant to do the right thing, and my family crushed him for it, not with bullets, with disgrace, because disgrace was cheaper and cleaner." Lena stood motionless. She looked at the telegram, looked at the approval handwriting in the corner, and inside her mind, 9 years rearranged themselves in silence. Her father's final 6 months, the stamped letters never mailed, the thin little funeral in the rain where friends of 30 years had not dared come because they were afraid of being stained by his name. Her mother's face beginning to forget in those years, as though her memory had chosen to punch holes in its own hull so it would not have to carry the rest of life. She did not cry. Tears were too private a thing to fall in a room with this man in it. She only asked, her voice low and dry, "How long have you known?" 3 days, he said, "and it took you 3 days to decide whether to tell me." He did not look away. "Yes, because saying it meant you would lose something. Yes, then why say it at all?" Adriano was silent for 1 beat, and when he answered, he spoke the only sentence he had prepared, not for her but for himself, because an apology is something people ask for themselves, so they can feel lighter. "I didn't come here to ask for that. I came so you would know the truth, because it belongs to you, not to me. I held it for 3 days, and those 3 days were theft." Lena stepped forward. She walked around the corner of the desk, slow and straight, and she slapped him once, with the whole arm of a woman who had spent 10 years carrying water buckets and pushing cleaning carts, the sound of the slap cracking through the wooden office like a small gunshot. Adriano's head turned to one side, then returned to its place, and he stood still, both hands at his sides, not lifting a hand to his cheek, receiving it the way a man receives a signature confirming delivery. She looked at him for 1 more second, her face bloodless and dry, then said, "I quit. Tell Mr. Calloway for me." Then she turned and walked out. She did not slam the door. She closed it gently, and it was that gentleness that remained in the room the longest. From that day on, Calloway Ridge fell ill. Ambra knew from the very first afternoon she was gone. He stood with his head turned toward the eastern stable door for 2 hours, and by the 2nd day the old fury had returned whole, as though it had never left. He kicked the stall wall in heavy rhythms all night, overturned the feed trough, allowed neither Boyd nor anyone else within 10 feet of him, and stopped eating, the hay in his manger untouched from morning until evening, the star-shaped hair whirl-soaked with the sweat of a despair that had no language. Quinn stood outside the fence every afternoon watching him, clutching her notebook to her chest without being able to write a single line. And Everett Calloway witnessed it all from the office window. He had seen Lena walk out of the farm with the straight back and steady steps of someone who had just buried a person for the second time, and he had heard, faintly through the wooden door, broken words, Hollis, staged, test sample, and that night, alone with a bourbon bottle more than half empty, he realized the hand holding his glass was trembling, not because of the liquor, but because of a calculation so simple it chilled him to the bone. The truth had begun to rise from the ground after 9 years, and truths never rise alone. They pull one another up like the roots of the same tree, and at the end of one of those roots was his name. News that Lena Hollis had quit, and the horse had turned savage again, reached Whitfield Prescott faster than a weather report, and in the cherry-paneled study overlooking his oak garden, the Southern gentleman sat gently swirling his bourbon glass, listening to Boyd Latham's report through the prepaid phone, then smiled to himself, because he had just realized the board had rearranged itself in a direction more beautiful than any move he could have calculated. A horse no one could handle no longer needed to be bought. That night he made another call, long distance, a New Jersey area code, and the man's voice that answered on the other end was rough as crushed stone. "No greeting, Frankie Ritchie here, talk," Prescott said, smooth and slow. "Mr. Ritchie. The Kentucky situation has just shifted in our favor. The purchase is no longer necessary. I propose a cleaner option. We orchestrate a tragic accident at the stables this week. We eliminate that troublesome horse, and more importantly, ensure whatever old records the Hollis girl is digging up burn to ashes along with it. Mr. Calloway loses his most valuable collateral. The bank forecloses on schedule. Your fund buys the corpse for farmland prices. And there you have 200 acres of clean land in the middle of the Gloudsons for your money to rest its feet." As for the Ferrante family, Prescott took a sip of bourbon. The Ferrante family goes home empty-handed in front of the entire world. 3 birds with 1 arrow, sir. The New Jersey end went silent for a moment. Then a hoarse laugh sounded. "I like the way you aristocrats talk, Wit, like you're reading from a menu. Fine, my people will be down in 3 days. You handle the gate." The gate had a name, Boyd Latham. The stable manager received his instructions on Friday afternoon, and followed each step with the meticulous care of a man who had sold himself for too long to let his hands shake. At 10 o'clock that night, he went into the equipment room, opened the control cabinet, and shut down the entire farm's camera system through a routine maintenance operation duly recorded in the log. At 10:20, he removed the chain from the back gate, the iron gate bordering the pasture that the fire trucks and veterinary trucks still used, pushed it almost closed, then went back to his room above the tax storage, turned off the light, and sat in the dark waiting for the engine sound. At 11:15, a truck pulling a horse trailer painted with the logo of a real transport company in Tennessee rolled quietly through the back gate with its headlights off. 4 men got out, dark jackets, moving cleanly and silently like men who had done this many times before. They opened the trailer door, lowered the rubber-lined ramp to muffle the noise, and headed toward the last stall in the row with ropes, a metal bit, and a bag of feed mixed with a horse dose of sedatives. But there was one thing in no one's plan, not even Prescott's, the man who could calculate human hearts but had never calculated the heart of a horse. Ambra smelled them before the stable door was even open. 4 days of being abandoned had brought the old rage back, and now that rage met the scent of strangers in the dark, the smell of rope, the smell of drugged feed mixed into grain, and the black horse exploded like a mine. He would not let any rope loop touch his head. He reared inside the stall, shattered the cross plank, and his scream tore through the farm's quiet night, long, high, wild, and the whole row of 20 horses woke and screamed with him, kicked the walls with him, a chorus of panic. One of the 4 men cursed. Someone shouted, "Where's the light? Where's the light?" And one man grabbed the spare storm lantern hanging from the center post in the corridor, lit it, and raised it high just as Ambra's backward kick burst the stall latch loose. The wooden door flew open and slammed into the shoulder of the man holding the lantern, and the storm lantern left his hand, spun through a short arc, fell at the base of the dry haystack piled beside the feed storage, shattered, and in 2 seconds, only 2 seconds, a flame no bigger than a hand licked at one strand of hay, found it to its liking, and stood up. Fire in a dry hay storage room does not burn, it devours. By the time the four men abandoned rope and feet alike and fled back to the truck, smoke had already thickened beneath the tin roof, red glare spilling from the southeast corner of the stable, the farm's only fire alarm, the one Boyd had not shut off because no one had thought of it, began screaming in hoarse bursts. The truck roared through the back gate and vanished into the dark pasture, and in the stable row, slowly filling with smoke, 20 horses screamed and kicked at their doors. Among them, one black horse thrashing in a stall with a broken latch but refusing to run out, because outside smelled only of strangers, and inside was the only place he knew. In the small attic room of the main house, Quinn Calloway was sleeping at the farm that night, the way she still begged to do every weekend, and she bolted awake at the sound of the alarm, ran to the window, saw the sky over the stable turning, raw red and black coils of smoke swallowing the yard lights. She heard her grandfather shouting downstairs, footsteps running, someone calling 911, and in that panic, the 12-year-old child did the clearest-headed thing anyone did that night. She snatched up the phone, did not call the fire department because her grandfather was already calling, and dialed the only number she knew by heart besides family numbers, the number she had asked for during that first week standing at the round pen fence, with her notebook clutched in her hands, and 9 miles away, in the pitch-dark trailer on the southern edge of Lexington, where a woman lay awake for the 4th night in a row among her father's keepsakes, the phone began to ring, sharp, urgent, tearing the darkness in two. Lena didn't remember what she had put on. Only Quinn's choked voice on the phone. Fire, Lena, the stable's on fire. Ambra's still in there. And 11 minutes later, her old pickup was skidding across the gravel yard of Callaway Ridge into a scene like a small apocalypse. Headlights bleeding through the smoke. Workers from the outbuildings running back and forth with buckets and garden hoses. Everett standing without a coat and shouting himself hoarse as he directed people to release the horses from the western row into the round pen. While in the southeast corner, where the hay storage joined the main stable row, the fire had already eaten through the tin roof, spraying red tongues up into the night sky. She jumped down from the truck in the same wrinkled gray janitor's uniform she'd worn for 4 days without caring enough to change, and amid all the sirens, shouts, and crackling pops of burning wood, her ears locked onto one sound only, Ambra's scream from deep inside the smoke-choked corridor, no longer the wild scream of rage, but something higher, thinner, the cry of a living creature calling out. Someone grabbed her shoulder as she rushed toward the east door, an old worker yelling in her face, "Are you crazy? It's going to collapse." But Lena pulled free with the strangely calm motion of a woman who'd already made her decision before she arrived. She snatched up a wet towel someone had dropped beside the hose, pressed it over her nose and mouth, and walked into the smoke. Inside, the world shrank to about 16 feet of gray, clouded sight, heat pressing down from the roof like a hand, and Lena moved along the corridor by the memory of hundreds of mornings. 12 steps past the tack room, turn left, one hand feeling along the iron bars, her mouth beginning to speak the moment her feet began to move, low, steady, slow, the voice of 5 o'clock in the morning, of feed buckets and the sound of a broom. I'm here. And at the end of the corridor, inside the stall whose latch had burst loose, she saw him, that enormous black mass turning and thrashing in the smoke, sweat shining over him, eyes rolling white, and when her small gray shape appeared in the doorway, the horse froze halfway through a turn, his nostrils flaring wide, drawing in the air, searching, finding, the scent of cedar oil cutting through the smoke, and he stood still. Lena held no rope, no whip, nothing at all. She did the only thing she'd done since the very first morning. She held out her open palm in the burning corridor and waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. The tin roof over the hay storage sagged with a shriek like an animal, and then the most vicious black horse in Kentucky stepped toward her through the billowing smoke. He lowered his massive head and pressed his muzzle firmly into her open palm, anchoring himself to her presence amidst the roaring flames. Lena pressed her forehead to the soaked, star-shaped whirl for only one breath, then said, "Come with me," and turned her back and walked, not gripping his mane, not pulling, only walking. And that half-ton of muscle followed her through the smoke-filled corridor, 1 step at a time, his muzzle just barely touching her shoulder like a compass needle touching glass, past the tack room, through the final 12 steps, out into the cold air and the flashing lights, amid the stunned cries breaking from the crowd that neither she nor the horse seemed to hear. At the same time, by the back gate, an ambush unfolded so cleanly that almost no one in the yard knew it was happening. The truck, falsely marked with the Tennessee Trotort Company's logo, hadn't made it more than 2 miles down the field road because Adriano Ferrante, the man who'd spent 3 days tormenting himself across an entire hotel floor, had received Aldo's call about the farm fire while still awake, and the machine inside him, the machine that had never needed more than 5 seconds to give an order, had returned to full power. 2 of his cars blocked the truck from the front and the back on the narrow dirt road, their headlights switching on all at once, and the 4 New Jersey men stepped out with their hands raised to shoulder height before an overwhelming ring of men and gun muzzles aimed low toward the ground, exactly Ferrante style, not one shot fired, only absolute numbers and Aldo Greco's voice, calm as a public notice. "Gentlemen, get down on your knees before you get tired." Boyd Latham was found by Adriano himself in the equipment room, trembling as he tried to erase the system log, and when the stable manager turned and saw who was standing in the doorway, his face turned the color of ash. Adriano looked at him for a long time, then said to 2 of his men in a voice no louder than conversation, "Tie him up." The police like their gifts wrapped. The Fayette County fire trucks arrived 4 minutes later, 3 trucks, hoses striking the hay storage from 2 directions, and within milliseconds the fire was forced back, pinned down, killed in the very corner where it had been born. The hay storage and the 2 empty end stalls were reduced to charcoal, but the main stable row stood. Not a single horse died, not a single human being had to be taken away in an ambulance, and when all the loud sounds had withdrawn, leaving only the drip of water from the roof and the distant crackle of radios, the yard of Callaway Ridge sank into the exhausted silence of a battlefield after the fighting. Lena stood in the middle of the yard with Ambra beside her. Soot streaked down her cheek, her hand still resting lightly on the neck of the horse, who was breathing hard but calm. And at the far end of the yard, 30 paces away, Adriano Ferrante stood beside his car, his shirt stained with smoke, watching her. He'd seen it all. From the moment that small gray figure walked empty-handed into the burning corridor and came out with half a ton of obedient fury behind her shoulder, and the man who'd spent his whole life measuring power by the fear he could plant in others stood there among the ashes and understood, late and completely, what real power looked like. It didn't force anything to kneel. It held out a hand and was followed. Lena looked up. Their eyes met across 30 paces of yard filled with puddles reflecting the fire truck's lights. No one stepped closer, no one nodded, no one spoke. Only one look lasted for the length of one breath from the horse. Then she turned away, leading Ambra toward the western round pen, where Quinn was waiting with a horse blanket clutched in her arms, and Adriano remained standing alone in the yard, among the smell of wet smoke and the red and blue lights, with the feeling of a man who'd just been shown something that all the money of 3 for Ferrante generations combined couldn't buy. Boyd Latham broke on the very first night in the Fayette County Police interrogation room, broke fast and broke to pieces, the way every middleman does when the price of loyalty is suddenly posted as 5 federal charges. He confessed to everything, the prepaid phone, the instructions, shutting off the cameras and opening the back gate, the 4 New Jersey men sitting in the next holding cell, and both names at the 2 ends of the string, Frankie Ricci, the man who paid, and Whitfield Prescott, the man who directed it. But by morning, when the lawyer Adriano had quietly hired for Callaway Farm sat reading through the statement, he tapped one finger on the table and said the thing everyone in the profession could see at once. Boyd's testimony against Ricci was solid. There was a vehicle, there were men, there were money transfers, but against Prescott it was thin as cigarette paper. All of it was only calls to a dead prepaid number, a southern voice any second-rate defense lawyer could rip apart in 10 minutes. No signature, no money trail, no fingerprints. The man in the ivory suit had spent 30 years in this world without leaving so much as an ink stain, and without something more. Prescott would attend his club's autumn party right on schedule, suitably saddened by the terrible news that wicked men had taken advantage of his good name. Adriano heard that report in his hotel room at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the old machine inside him, the machine assembled by 3 generations of Ferrantes, offered the old solution before he could stop it, one call, just one, to a phone number in Newark that the Ferrante family kept for rare occasions, and Whitfield Prescott would vanish from the earth as smoothly as he had lived on it. No trace, no trial, no risk. Philadelphia justice, quick, clean, permanent. He had already picked up the phone, and Aldo Greco, who had stood by the window through the whole report, who in 40 years had never once stepped between his boss and an order, walked over and placed his hand on the tabletop, not on the phone, only on the table beside it. But the gravity in the room changed. "You're going to call Newark," he said, not as a question. Adriano did not answer. Aldo looked at him with the eyes that had been watching him, since he was still too small to reach a saddle without standing on tiptoe, and for the first time in 40 years, he challenged an order before it had been given. "You kill him. You bury the only chance of clearing that girl's father," he said slowly, each word set down like paving stone. "Dead bodies can't testify in court, Adriano. Dead bodies don't name the laboratory that took the money, the inspector who signed the false report, and Wade Hollis's name will stay in the mud for another 9 years, another 90 years, forever, just so the Ferrant family can have one neat revenge." He straightened. "If you want to be like your father, make the call. If you want to be like your brother, find another way." The room stayed silent for a long time. Adriano set the phone face down on the table, and over the next 2 days the man used to giving orders that took 5 seconds began a task slower, messier, and more dangerous than any gang war he had ever survived, the work of doing the right thing inside a system with laws. He flew back to Philadelphia to meet the family's chief lawyer, a sly old fox who had taken early retirement named Castellani, a man who now handled only Ferrante matters, and placed everything on his desk: the photocopy of Wade Hollis's journal, with container numbers and dates, the old file Aldo had dug up, the photograph of Renato shaking Prescott's hand, the telegram with the approval signature, and Boyd's testimony, then said, "I want all of this delivered to the FBI's Louisville office, and the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission through official channels, through you, as counsel for a cooperating source, and I understand what that means." Castellani took off his glasses, wiped them, put them back on, and said, "What it means is that you're personally handing over evidence of a contraband transport route your family ran 20 years ago. The statute of limitations has expired on most of the criminal charges, but not on the press, not on your partners, not on the old men in Philadelphia who still meet every month. You're setting fire to the very chair you sit in. Do you understand that yet?" "I understand," Adriano said. "Do it." The call from Philadelphia came that very night exactly as predicted, the voice of the older man on the council no longer dry but hissing over the line. "You've lost your mind, Adriano. You're digging up your father's grave in the middle of the marketplace. The Kentucky Channel is closed forever. The partners are asking whether we can still keep our own mouths shut. The council demands that you withdraw the file before it leaves the lawyer's desk." And Adriano Ferrante stood by the window, looking down at the lights of Lexington coming on, listened to all of it without interrupting, then answered with a single sentence, slow and clear, before ending the call amid the roar from the other end. "My father left me 2 things, this chair and this debt. I'm keeping both." He did not call Lena, did not text, did not let anyone at Callaway Farm know what wheels had just begun turning in Louisville and Frankfurt. Aldo asked him why that evening, while the 2 men sat with 2 glasses of whiskey neither one of them drank, and Adriano looked into the darkness beyond the window for a while before he said, "Because if she knows, then it becomes a gift, and this isn't a gift. It's a debt. And people don't announce it when they pay a debt. They just pay." 11 days later, the fall stallion auction at Ashford Park opened beneath the crystal chandeliers of the 100-year-old auction pavilion, where the bluegrass elite gathered in tweed suits and pearls, sparkling wine on silver trays, and Whitfield Prescott stood at the very center of it all, as he had for 30 years, in the front row of the agent's section with a new fedora and that wide southern smile, shaking hands with farm owners, kissing ladies on the cheek, dropping a witty remark about the young horse being led. Around the ring that made the whole row around him burst into laughter, the easy laughter of people who believed the world had been arranged forever in their favor. The gavel had just fallen on the 11th horse when they came in. No sirens, no commotion, only the double doors at the back of the hall opening, and 6 people stepping through with a kind of walk that did not belong in that place. 4 FBI agents in dark blue jackets, with 3 gold letters across their backs, and 2 Kentucky State Police officers. They moved down the center aisle at a pace neither fast nor slow, and the hall quieted row by row as they passed, like cold water spreading across a tablecloth. The auctioneer stopped in the middle of a sentence, the gavel suspended in the air, and those 6 people came to a halt directly in front of the first row of the agent's section. "Mr. Whitfield Prescott," the lead agent said, his voice even and loud enough in the now silent hall. "You are under arrest by order of the federal court for the Western District of Kentucky." And in front of 400 people who had once raised glasses with him, married their children into his circles, and laughed at every joke he had told for 3 decades, the beloved Southern gentleman was asked to stand, was read his rights, and was handcuffed, 2 bright steel circles flashing beneath the crystal lights as they closed around the wrists that wore the family crest ring. His fedora slipped from the chair and rolled across the floor, and no one picked it up. The only sound in the whole pavilion then was the whispering beginning to rise from the rear rows, the whispering of the very class that had lived on whispers, names breathed under their breath. Doping, Hollis, 9 years ago, dear God. So that's what happened. And Whitfield Prescott walked down the center aisle, beneath 400 pairs of eyes, with his back still trying to remain straight. But anyone close enough could see that the Southern smile had gone out, and for the first time in 30 years, the laughter in that hall did not belong to him, but fell on him drop by drop, through the longest 40 steps of his life. That same afternoon in New Jersey, Frankie Ricci heard the news through exactly 1 phone call, cursed exactly once, then ordered every line of contact with Kentucky shut down. Men pulled back, numbers erased, the land purchase plan canceled. That old fox had survived so long because he knew exactly when a chessboard had become someone else's chessboard, and in a single afternoon, the bluegrass was cleared of both spiders that had spun their webs across it. But, on the southern edge of Lexington, in front of an old trailer, there was a 3rd det standing trembling in the autumn wind, a det wearing a waxed canvas coat and holding a hat in both hands. Everett Calloway had parked out by the road and walked the final stretch, the way a person walks the final stretch to a church for confession, and when Lena opened the door, he did not ask to come inside. He stood at the bottom of the steps, looked up at her, and said, "Give me 5 minutes, and after that you can close the door any way you want." She stood still, and he began, in the voice of a man who had practiced his opening line all night and still stumbled over it. "9 years ago, I was one of the witnesses at your father's hearing." He looked down at the hat in his hands. "They came to me a week before, very polite, said all they needed was for me to confirm that I had seen irregular things at the Hollis stables, small things, strange cars parked there at night, unmarked veterinary medicine crates, all the kinds of things any farm might have if someone wanted to see them, and if I didn't confirm it, Callaway Ridge's refinancing loan at the bank would run into trouble. That season, my farm was on the edge. Quinn had just lost her mother, and Everett stopped, his throat working up and down, and I stood on the witness stand, placed my hand on the Bible, and said what they told me I had seen. I told myself maybe it was true, that my words were only one small brick in a wall someone else had built. But you know something, every wall is built out of small bricks, laid by people telling themselves that. The wind moved across the open ground and flipped the hem of the old man's waxed canvas coat. "Then your father died," he went on, softer now, "and I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't dare. But 2 years ago, when a girl with the Hollis name came to my farm looking for work, I hired her at once without asking for references, and I paid you wages all these years. Not out of kindness, child." He lifted his head, and the eyes of the 68-year-old man were red in the evening light. "Because cowardice needs to see its victim's face every day too, so it doesn't forget what it is." Lena stood on the trailer steps, her arms folded over her chest, not because of the cold, and she listened to all of it without interrupting once. Her face did not soften, did not harden. It was only tired in the way of someone who had just been handed one more stone for a backpack already full. When he finished, she stayed silent for a long while, long enough for the old man to prepare himself for the door to slam shut, but the door did not close. "I don't need anyone's apology," she said at last, her voice low and flat. "Not yours, not his, not anyone's in this state." She looked past his shoulder toward the horizon, where the lights of Lexington were beginning to kindle in the dusk. "I need my father's name written back the right way. That's all." Then she stepped back inside and closed the door, not slammed, closed. And Everett Calloway stood for a while longer before the lighted trailer, put his hat back on, and walked back out to the road in the evening shadows. Lighter than when he had come by exactly the weight of one secret, and heavier than when he had come by exactly the weight of an answer, 3 weeks after the arrest at Ashford Park. A thick envelope bearing the seal of the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission was delivered by certified mail to the trailer on the southern edge of Lexington, and Lena Hollis sat on the edge of the bed and read it 3 times from beginning to end, the dry administrative lines she had memorized from the first reading, based on new evidence transferred by the FBI Louisville office, based on testimony from relevant parties in the pending case. The Commission hereby vacates the full disciplinary ruling, issued 9 years earlier against Mr. Wade Hollis, restores his trainer's license posthumously, and removes his name from the permanent list of violations, along with, on the final page, one line no administrative document was required to include, but someone in Frankfurt had decided to write, "The Commission extends its deepest and belated condolences to the Hollis family." On Saturday afternoon, she carried the decision out to the small cemetery on a hill in Woodford County, where her father lay beneath a plain gray headstone, carved only with his name and 2 years, the November hill already stripped of nearly all its leaves, and she sat down on the dry grass beside the grave as though sitting beside a person, not kneeling, not standing at attention, sitting. The easy cross-legged way she and her father used to sit on the training fence, at lunchtime eating sandwiches long ago. She placed the decision on the stone before the headstone, held it down with a pebble, then opened the leather pouch and left the flap open so the scent of cedar could rise and mingle with the smell of dry grass, and she began to tell him, in an ordinary voice, the voice people use to tell stories in a kitchen, without choking once. "Dad, let me tell you something. It's a long story. There's a black horse, you know him. He has that star whorl between his eyes. He's the worst behaved horse in Kentucky, and he remembered you for 9 years." And she told him everything, about the ear turning toward the sound of her broom, about the 5 o'clock morning beside the stall bars, about the night of the fire and the smoke-filled corridor, about the photograph she had finally dared to turn over, about her mother and the pencil drawings filled solid black with the star whorl. "Mom hasn't forgotten, Dad. She just put it somewhere too deep." And about the paper lying under the pebble. "They wrote it back," she said, 9 years late, "but they wrote it back. Your name is clean now, just like the day you taught me to saddle a horse for the first time." Wind ran across the hill and lifted the corner of the decision like a small waving hand. Lena sat there for a long time after that, until the sunlight had tilted fully west. Then she stood, brushed grass from her pants, laid one hand on the top of the headstone, the way people pat one another on the shoulder, and walked down the hill. Early the following week, the old lawyer Castellani called her as a matter of procedure, to confirm that the family had received the decision and ask whether she had any further legal requests. And at the end of the call, when Lena asked the question she had meant not to ask, "Sir, where did that new evidence come from?" the old man went silent for a long stretch in the way only a lawyer can, then said, "I'm bound by confidentiality with my client, Miss Hollis. I can only say the file was submitted by a voluntary cooperating source, someone who understood very clearly the price of submitting it, and I've practiced law for 40 years, Miss Hollis. And I've never seen anyone pay that price with such a straight back. Have a good day." He did not say the name. He did not need to. Lena stood in the middle of the trailer with the dead phone in her hand, and every piece fitted itself into place. His 3 days of silence before the confession, the way he had said I held it for 3 days, and those 3 days were theft, and the absolute silence since then. Not one call, not one message, not one bouquet of flowers. The man who could price everything had paid the greatest debt of his life, in the only way that kept it from becoming a gift, in silence. She found him on Wednesday afternoon at the farm, where he still came every day, to oversee the rebuilding of the burned hay storage, even though no one mentioned the horse purchase anymore. She saw him standing alone at the fence of the western round pen, no vest, shirt sleeves rolled, watching ombre graze in the pale sunlight, and she walked over to stand beside him at the fence, one arm's length away, both of them looking at the horse, not at each other. "I spoke to your lawyer," she said. "He talks too much," Adriano answered. "He didn't say anything at all," she said, and that was enough. The black horse lifted his head and looked toward them, then lowered it to the grass again, reassured. "You didn't ask for forgiveness," Lena said after a while, her eyes still on the horse, "so I didn't bring it. I brought this." She drew from her coat pocket a page that had been carefully removed from the spine of the brown leather journal and handed it to him, and Adriano took it with both hands, the way someone receives a memorial photograph. On the page, in Wade Hollis's firm, slanted handwriting, he had written about a 6-month-old black foal, the day it startled at the sound of a slamming door and would not let anyone come near for 3 days. And the final line on the page, underlined once, "Trust can't be trained with a whip, and it can't be bought with grain. It only comes one way. You stay, day after day, until it believes you aren't going anywhere." Adriano read the page twice, and the man whose hand had never trembled while signing anything held that thin sheet of paper with the care people give to the most fragile thing ever placed in their hands. "He was better than my 3 East Coast experts put together," he said at last, his voice a little rough. "He was better than everyone put together," Lena said. They stood beside each other at the fence for a long while after that, both arms resting on the top rail, a handspan between them, then half a handspan when she shifted her weight, and neither of them moved away. The black horse grazing in the afternoon sun, the November wind running along the valley, and the distance between their 2 hands on the fence rail, for the first time after everything, measured only in millimeters, not touching, not needing to touch yet, only 2 hands staying on the same piece of wood, this day. And as both of them silently understood, day after day to come, the idea came from Quinn, as most of the right ideas in this story did. The girl had heard Lena talk about the pencil drawings in the nursing home, and asked in that blunt, straight-ahead voice of hers, "So why don't you let her meet the real horse?" And Lena had opened her mouth to explain about her mother's illness, about how the trip would exhaust her, about the risks of a cold afternoon, then closed it again, because she suddenly realized she was listing the reasons for fear, not for love. She asked the nursing home doctor, a woman with salt and pepper hair who had cared for Ruth for 3 years, and the doctor said what medicine knows but rarely says aloud. "At this stage, Miss Hollis, there's nothing left for us to cure. All we can do now is make room for moments. Your mother is clearest in the early afternoon. Stimulation tied to old memories can sometimes open a door medicine can't open. Take her, dress her warmly, and don't expect, just receive." On a Thursday afternoon in early December, one of those rare days when the sky was clear and the wind had gone still, the Meadowbrook van stopped in front of the yard at Callaway Ridge, and Lena pushed her mother's wheelchair down the ramp. Ruth was wrapped in a gray wool scarf, wearing a knit cap, small as a winter bird, her distant eyes drifting over the farmyard, over the stable row, over the people standing far off and trying to pretend they weren't looking. Everett by the office door with his hat in his hands, Quinn on the round pen fence, and at the far edge of the yard, beneath the shadow of the tack room roof, Adriano Ferrante standing with his arms folded, far enough away not to belong to the scene, close enough not to take his eyes from it. Lena pushed her mother's chair down the stable corridor toward the western round pen, speaking little things that needed no answer. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Almost there, Mom." And Ruth nodded drowsily to the rhythm of the wheels, until they rounded the corner of the storage room, and the round pen opened before them. Pale gold afternoon light spread over the faded grass, and in the middle of the pen, the black horse stood there, unbound, unheld, lifting his head from a patch of grass the instant the sound of the rolling wheels reached his ears. The wheelchair stopped, not because Lena stopped it, but because Ruth had taken hold of both wheels with her own hands, with a strength no one still believed those hands possessed, and the 63-year-old woman sat motionless, watching the horse come forward, step by step, slow, straight, through the afternoon light, up to the fence, where he lowered his great head to the level of her eyes, the star-shaped whorl between his eyes less than an arm's length from her face. "Star whorl," Ruth said, only 2 words, but that voice made Lena grip the wheelchair handles, because it wasn't the drifting voice that asked, "Nurse, what day is it today?" It was her mother's voice, the voice of the old kitchen in summer evenings, clear, warm, with depth beneath it. "Star whorl," Ruth repeated, and her hand rose, reaching over the fence rail to rest on the bridge of the horse's nose. "Wade said this one would be the horse of his life," she said. "He came home late for supper all week because of him. He said, 'Ruth, this foal doesn't learn with his head, he learns with his heart, and we have to teach him with something real in us, because you can't fake anything with him.'" Then Ruth did the thing Lena would carry with her to the end of her life. She leaned forward in the wheelchair, lifted her other hand too, and cupped the horse's face between both palms, one hand on each cheek, the way people hold the face of a child who has come home after being gone too long, and said, so softly that only the horse and her daughter could hear, I know you. The black horse half closed his eyes, breathed a long warm breath between the cuffs of her wool sleeves, and stood perfectly still. Then Ruth turned her head. She looked at the young woman standing behind the wheelchair with tears already filling both eyes, looked straight at her, saw her for the first time in so many months, and said, Lena, my daughter. Lena collapsed to her knees beside the wheelchair. Look at me, Ruth said, one hand still on the horse's face, the other resting on her daughter's hair. Your father's hand is still in this horse. Do you see that? And in you too. I can tell just by looking. Your hands are so much alike. Lena pressed her face into her mother's shoulder and cried without sound, her shoulders shaking in waves. And Ruth held her daughter's head and soothed her with the rhythm of 30 years ago. While at the edge of the yard, the man standing beneath the shadow of the storage roof turned his face away and looked toward the distant hills, because there are reunions for which the only polite thing a witness can do is not witness all of it. Before they left, Ruth asked for the drawing pad in her bag, pulled out the top page, the newest one, drawn in pencil like all the others, but this time the black horse did not stand in the middle of an empty page. He stood before a porch with steps and a railing, and she handed it to Lena and said, Put it in your father's leather pouch. Now the set is complete. Lena opened the pouch, laid the drawing neatly on top of the bundle of letters, and when she looked up, Ruth was gazing toward the office door, where Everett Calloway still stood staring with his hat crushed in both hands. And the woman looked at him for a very long time, long enough that the old man lowered his eyes to the gravel. Then she nodded, once slow and small, a nod no one dared define in words, but Everett Calloway suddenly had to turn back into the office very quickly, and no one followed him. On the way back to the van, halfway through a conversation about needing to bring more carrots next time, Ruth's voice suddenly softened by 1 degree, and she looked around the farmyard again and asked, the mist already beginning to settle over her voice once more, Nurse, are we going home now? I'm a little tired. Lena swallowed the ache in her throat, tucked the blanket back around her mother, and said, Yes, Mom, we're going home. You'll sleep a little, and we'll be there before you know it. The door had closed, gently, the same way it had opened, but Lena did not cry again all the way back, because she finally understood what the doctor with salt and pepper hair had meant. People don't get to keep the door. They only get to keep what they manage to carry through it. And that afternoon, in the leather pouch on Lena's lap, beside the bundle of letters and the photograph, there was a drawing with a porch in it, and inside her chest, 3 words, my daughter. Warm enough for many winters to come, in mid-December, the old lawyer Castellani flew down to Lexington for the 3rd time in a month, and this time he brought 2 thick files bound in blue, set them on the wooden table in the Calloway farm office before everyone involved, and began reading in the flat, steady voice of 40 years of notarized documents. The first document was short, only 3 pages, a transfer of ownership for a 9-year-old black stallion, registered name Ombra, from Mr. Adriano Ferrante, who had completed the purchase of the horse from Calloway Ridge at the original agreed price, not reduced by a single cent, to Miss Lena Marie Hollis. Form of transfer gift, transaction value, $0, attached conditions. Mr. Castellani turned the page, none. Lena looked at the word none for a long time, then looked at the man, standing by the window trying to appear concerned with the scenery, and she signed, in the straight, firm handwriting inherited from a horse trainer. The second document was much thicker, and as Castellani read, the room grew quieter with every line. A new trust fund legally registered in the state of Kentucky. Initial capital, contributed from the audited personal assets of Mr. Adriano Ferrante. Not $1 of it tied to the old structures in Philadelphia. Castellani emphasized this point by looking over his glasses at the entire room. This fund purchased the full debt of Calloway Ridge from the First Bank of Lexington, permanently removed the threat of foreclosure, and restructured the farm into a nonprofit operating under a new charter, registered name, the Emilio Ferrante Equine Therapy Farm. Purpose, rehabilitation through equine therapy for veterans and children needing special support, with letters of agreement already in place, with Lexington Veterans Hospital and 2 nearby school districts. The charter stated 3 things that everyone listening understood had not been written by the lawyer but by the founder himself. First, Every current member of the farm staff would be retained under new contracts, with wages matching those of the larger bluegrass farms, meaning nearly double their old pay, and the people in faded uniforms who had once stood along the wall on that October morning now had each of their names listed in the contract appendix. Second, the position of training director would be offered to Miss Lena Hollis, daughter and student of trainer Wade Hollis, whose license had just been restored by the commission, and when Castellani read that part, Lena had to lay her hand on the tabletop, because it was the very title her father had promised to give her on her 20th birthday, the birthday that never arrived the way it should have. Third, the farm would accept its first official training apprentice, with a proper apprenticeship stipend under state labor law, Miss Quinn Calloway, 12 years old, to study outside school hours under her grandfather's guardianship, and Quinn, who had been listening from the doorway, made a sound that was half sob and half cry of joy before running out into the yard, where people later saw her standing for a long time, with her face pressed into Ambra's neck by the fence. Everett Calloway was invited to stay on as operations advisor, to keep the main house, to keep the Calloway name on the boundary marker beside the farm's new name, and the old man heard it with his head lowered, understanding exactly what it was, not a reward, but the kindest sentence anyone could have handed him, to stay, to work, to pass each day through a stable named for a lost brother and a cleared father, a paying for his wrong with the only thing left in his life, labor. The other names in the story closed their files in different places. Boyd Latham signed a plea agreement in the second week of the month, trading full testimony for a lighter sentence that was still long enough for his hair to go gray in federal prison. Frankie Ritchie sent a brief message through intermediaries to Philadelphia, essentially saying New Jersey had no dispute with the Ferrante family, then vanished from every Kentucky radar as though he had never existed. Whitfield Prescott's trial was set for spring, with a witness list that grew longer every week, because when a 30-year tree falls, people finally see how many things it had been pressing down. Aldo Greco's name appeared in no document, and it did not need to. He remained where he had stood for 40 years, behind Adriano's right shoulder, except now people often saw him down at the stable feeding carrots to the horses and talking with Quinn about note-taking techniques. On the afternoon the papers were signed, after everyone else had gone, Lena found Adriano where she knew she would find him, at the fence of the Western Round Pen, and she asked the real question, not a polite one. What about Philadelphia? He was silent for a long while before answering. The council isn't finished with me. The Kentucky Channel is closed, but there are 6 others, and old contracts, old people, old debts. I'll have to go back and take them apart one by one. Some can be taken apart with paperwork, some will have to be taken apart another way. It will take time, and it won't be as clean as this trust fund. He turned to look at her and summed up his whole life in the voice of a man speaking the complete truth for the first time. A person doesn't leave the dark through just one door, Lena. She nodded slowly, receiving that as one receives weather, not demanding that it be different. Then she looked toward the stable row, where the last sunlight of the day was draining from the eastern, the same way. Door where one October morning a cleaning woman had once stood unseen by almost everyone, and she said, not looking at him, though every word landed exactly where it belonged, then every time you come back, use the east door. It's always the only one I leave open. 6 months later, spring returned to the Bluegrass Valley, the way it had been returning for 100 years, young grass spreading green across 200 acres, dogwood blossoms opening white along the gravel road, and on the marker post at the farm gate, beneath the name Calloway Ridge faded by rain and sun, a new wooden sign had been carved with the words Emilio Ferrante Equine Therapy Farm. That Saturday morning, the farm was as lively as a small festival. In the Eastern Round Pen, a young veteran who had lost one leg was practicing his balance on the back of a gentle mare, under the guidance of 2 staff members in new green uniforms, the same people who had once stood along the wall in silence on that October morning, now wearing name tags embroidered with their own correct names on their chests, and having their own voices in every farm meeting. In the far corner of the yard, Quinn Calloway, now almost a hand taller, was crouching in front of 4 children, patiently teaching them how to hold their palms flat when feeding carrots to a horse. The notebook from those early days now turned into 3 notebooks, stacked inside the locked cabinet of an official apprentice. And on the porch of the main house, where there were steps and a railing just like the pencil drawing lying inside the leather pouch, Ruth Hollis sat in the warm sunlight with a thin blanket over her knees and a drawing pad in her lap. Meadowbrook was now only the place she went back to sleep. On afternoons when the weather was kind, she was brought here, and though there were days when she called her daughter the nurse, and days when she only sat watching the clouds, the hand that held the pencil had not stopped drawing for a single day. And every time Everett Calloway passed the porch, he stopped to pour more tea into her cup, quietly, steadily, the way a person repays a debt with the small coins of daily devotion. And in the middle of the sun-filled farmyard, the 27-year-old woman stood beside the largest black horse in the region. She wore a new green work uniform that still smelled faintly of fresh cloth, simple like every uniform she had ever worn, except for one thing on the chest, where 9 months earlier there had been the name of a stranger because she had not had $12 for a patch. There were now 2 neat embroidered lines, Lena Hollis, training director. And she lifted her hand to stroke the thick black mane and smiled, a smile no longer tired, while the most vicious black horse in Kentucky, the horse who now let children touch his nose every weekend, lowered his great head, pressed his muzzle into her palm, and stood still, the way he had stood on a morning filled with smoke, the way he had stood on a morning filled with mocking laughter, the way he would keep standing as long as that hand was offered. Then came the sound of footsteps on gravel, and Lena didn't need to turn around to know. The eastern door of the stable opened, and Adriano Ferrante stepped through it, that very door, the man who had just returned after many weeks in Philadelphia, with dismantling still unfinished, and likely to remain unfinished for a long time. But this time he did not stop in the shadow of the doorway, to watch like an outsider. He stepped fully into the sunlight, crossed the yard, and came to stand beside her, beside the horse, inside the same frame, and in that frame, beneath the Kentucky spring sun, no one laughed at anyone. There was only the sound of children cheering from the training ring, the sound of a mother's pencil moving on the porch, and the slow breathing of a horse that had come home. Ombre never saw a janitor's uniform. He only read the quiet language of a healing heart. That is the ultimate truth of this journey, that true human worth cannot be measured by a name patch, a bank statement, or a social status, but by the devotion in the hands we extend to life. True respect is a debt we owe to every soul we cross, and the deepest wounds are mended not by hollow words, but by the quiet courage to stand up for what is right. What about you? Have you ever missed a beautiful soul because you were blinded by their appearance? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We would love to hear how this journey touched your heart. And don't forget to press the like button if today's story gave you something warm. Share this video with someone you believe deserves to be seen for who they truly are. And subscribe to our channel with the notification bell so you don't miss the moving and meaningful stories we send to you every day, because next week's story is already waiting for you. Thank you for staying with us until this very moment. May you and your family always have good health, a joyful life, and may every passing day be peaceful and serene. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.